The Memphis Belle is a true American icon that all Americans should come and see sometime in their lifetime. When the Memphis Belle movie in 1944 was premiered to President Roosevelt, after he got done watching it, he said, "Every American needs to see this film." And just as President Roosevelt said about the film, every American should come and see this artifact. It is woven into our history, and there were more than 30,000 young men who served in these heavy bombers and died in order to defeat an evil regime and to help provide the freedom that we enjoy today. So just as every American should see the Arizona at Pearl Harbor and other examples of sacrifice in our country's history, every American should really come and see this important artifact that is a touchstone in our history. The Memphis Belle's significance to our airmen today is in roles and missions. The Air Force can do things that no other service can do. The Memphis Belle and striking enemy targets far behind enemy lines really illustrate a very important role and mission that the Air Force has. The Memphis Belle has a very special place in Air Force history, and in fact it's one of the Air Force's most precious and meaningful artifacts for our airmen today, because the Memphis Belle connects airmen today and in the future with the Air Force's proud past, and it also connects airmen with the Air Force's core values: service and sacrifice, excellence in all we do, and integrity first. The Memphis Belle, its crewmen, and the strategic bombing campaign really illustrate and represent those core values. The Memphis Belle in many ways embodies the special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom. The Memphis Belle flew from British airfields in southeastern England. The Memphis Belle was often escorted by British-built Spitfires, sometimes flown by RAF pilots or American pilots. And then also, the Memphis Belle represents the daytime strategic bombing campaign, which in partnership with the nighttime bombing campaign conducted by the RAF helped defeat Nazi Germany. The Air Force was part of the U.S. Army. It was called the Army Air Forces. And at the time it made a lot of sense. A lot of what the Army Air Forces did was support the Army either directly at the front, or they did transport or things like that. But there were air power theorists at the time that said air power can do so much more than just support the Army. It can be decisive. It can strike targets far behind enemy lines. Well, the first time that this was done on a large scale was in the strategic bombing campaign by the U.S. Army Air Forces in Europe. And the Memphis Belle is the symbol of this campaign. And because that campaign was successful, and the later campaign against Japan in World War II, that directly led to the creation of the U.S. as a separate service in 1947. So the Belle has a role as a symbol of the strategic bombing campaign that led to the creation of the U.S. Air Force. So the Memphis Belle is a famous aircraft, but as an artifact itself, it's actually very rare. It is the only heavy bomber that participated in this early in the strategic bombing campaign that is still with us. When the Memphis Belle was flying, we were taking tremendous losses. So here's an example. For the Memphis Belle's 25th mission, they were in a formation with 20 other B-17s. When we look at what happened to those 20 B-17s in the following months, 17 of those B-17s were shot down in combat. 2 of those B-17s were hit so badly that when they returned to base, they never flew again. So only one of those 20 airplanes that were in the formation with the Memphis Belle 25th mission survived to become war-weary. And when we look at the numbers of aircraft lost, most of the B-17s that were early in the bombing campaign were shot down or damaged so badly when they returned they never flew again. So there were very few that survived. Another important aspect of the Belle's rarity as an artifact is that it was there very early in the bombing campaign. The Memphis Belle's first mission was less than 3 months after the 8th Air Force's first heavy bomber mission over Europe. The missions that the Memphis Belle flew were not the 1,000 or 1,500 bomber raids that we imagine that happened later in the war. Some of the Memphis Belle's raids only had 30 or 40 bombers in the formation. So this is very, very early. We don't see the Belle getting escorted by American fighters until the very end of the tour. So this is late spring of 1943. So the Belle flew in combat very, very early. And at this time, it was really experimental in many ways. No nation had ever conducted a large-scale strategic bombing campaign during the day. So they're experimenting with tactics, formations, and things like that. And the lessons that are being learned are paid for in blood, of necessity. So the Belle is truly a rare artifact, and that is a heavy bomber that flew early in the bombing campaign when most of these aircraft didn't survive in combat. There is a really fantastic cultural aspect to the Memphis Belle's significance, and that's its nose art. Now, other countries, other air forces, they do from time to time display nose art. Although nose art is found on other air forces and other countries' aircraft, there is no greater expression than those found on Air Force aircraft. It's really, in some ways, uniquely American, the breadth of nose art that we find on Air Force aircraft. And there's kind of a juxtaposition here, because when one thinks of military, one thinks of uniform and regimented and rigid, and yet you see these incredible expressions of individuality on American aircraft. And perhaps the best illustration is the heavy bombers that flew in Europe in World War II. Most of the aircraft had some kind of nose art, and it represented things like family and love of country, and really the things that our airmen were fighting for. And the most well-known piece of nose art is the Memphis Belle nose art, which truly represents the girl waiting back home. You know, why these young guys were fighting, so that they could earn the right to come back to their families and be free and be safe. And with the Memphis Belle being the most well-known expression of nose art, that's another really important aspect of the Memphis Belle significance. So we have some wonderful examples of the heritage of the Memphis Belle nose art here at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force. There was an F-105D called the Memphis Belle II, and that actual aircraft is on display in our Southeast Asia War Gallery, painted as it appeared during the Southeast Asia War with the Memphis Belle nose art. And then there was the Memphis Belle III, which was a B-52G that wore the Memphis Belle nose art, and a panel from that aircraft with the nose art on it is on display in our Cold War Gallery. The Memphis Belle has a very important role connecting popular culture and American understanding with Air Force history and heritage. You know, the average person really doesn't connect with Air Force history and heritage in their everyday lives, of course. Now, we're very proud of what we do here at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force to make that connection, but the Belle is really unique in many ways in connecting popular culture to the American public, and it did it in many different ways. Of course, during the war, it went on the war bond tour, was very famous. You know, the Memphis Belle was a name that was spoken in American households across the country. But then in 1944, the movie The Memphis Belle, A Story of a Flying Fortress, further cemented the fame. Millions of Americans went and saw this movie, and of course it's readily available today on the internet. It's open source, and so one can very easily find that movie on the internet. It's still viewed by millions and millions of people across the globe. And then in 1990, there was a fictionalized Hollywood movie about the Memphis Belle, and that connected the Belle to younger generations. And then of course now with this wonderful restoration that's taking place at the National Museum and the fabulous exhibit that's going to surround the Belle, the fame of the Belle will continue to go on for generations and generations, telling this story of these amazing airmen who served and sacrificed to defeat Nazi Germany in World War II.